All right, let's jump straight into this explainer. We're starting at the absolute dramatic climax. December 8th, 2024, at Damascus International Airport. It's a scene of total chaotic urgency. But the panic isn't coming from everyday travelers. It's coming from Bashar al Assad. A man who ruled Syria with an iron fist for 24 years is now literally racing toward an airplane, desperate to get airborne before his pursuers or, well, his own fate catch up with him.
And just like that, in a matter of hours, a regime that spanned nearly a quarter of a century just evaporated. What's really wild about the suddenness of this collapse is how well he masked it until the absolute last second. I mean, just hours before his escape, Assad was packing his bags, calmly telling his staff it was simply the end of the workday and he was quote-unquote going home. He even called his media advisor to prep a speech. It was the ultimate illusion of control right up until the moment he boarded that plane, fleeing first to Khmeimim Air Base and eventually to Moscow. And while he was escaping to live out his days as a political refugee, opposition forces were already walking right through the front doors of the presidential palace in Damascus.
Okay, so to understand how this seemingly invincible regime fell apart so fast, we really need to snap back to the year 2000. Because the thing is, Bashar al-Assad was never actually supposed to be the president. His father, Hafez al-Assad, had been grooming Bashar's older brother, Basil, for the top job. But after Basil tragically died in a car crash, Bashar was suddenly thrust right into the spotlight. When Hafez passed away in 2000, Bashar was only 34 years old, which was well below the constitutional minimum age of 40 for a Syrian president. So the parliament is forced into this frantic emergency session to literally change the constitution and lower the age limit to 34 just so Bashar could take the seat. And honestly, this brilliantly illustrates the illusion of his absolute power right from day one. Once they changed the constitution, the Ba'ath Party, which was the only legally dominant political party in Syria, put him forward as the sole candidate. The public didn't get to vote between different people. They were simply asked if they supported Bashar. And the official result? A staggering 97.29% approval rating. It was a complete rubber stamp referendum, just a total theatrical production of legitimacy. So because his political legitimacy was entirely an illusion, Assad's regime had to rely heavily on a symbiotic relationship with the Alawite minority. He inherited this strategy from his dad: favor the Alawites, give them the absolute top state and military positions, and in return they'll protect the regime out of the sheer fear that if the Assads fall, they fall with them. But the human cost of that strategy was just catastrophic. The Syrian civil war was ruthless. In the year 2014 alone, around 110,000 Alawites were killed. Families were losing entire generations of young men. Morale completely tanked, leading to nearly 100,000 troop desertions that same year. The very shield protecting Assad was bleeding out. And you'd think he'd try to patch things up, right? But instead, Assad's paranoia only made things worse. Fast forward to 2020. Assad executes this ruthless purge against his own cousin, Rami Makhlouf, who is the head of Syriatel, Syria's biggest telecommunications company. Assad actually seizes his own cousin's assets under the guise of tax evasion. This sent a massive, chilling message to his closest allies. It doesn't matter how loyal you are, if you're no longer useful, you're gone. Now, running right alongside this military decay was an absolute economic nosedive. Over 14 years of civil war, the domestic economy didn't just shrink, it collapsed entirely. In 2010, right before the war kicked off, Syria's GDP was sitting around $60 billion. By 2024, the World Bank estimates it had crashed all the way down to just $21 billion. Nearly two-thirds of the national economy simply vanished into the smoke of war, sending out global shockwaves that fueled one of the biggest refugee crises in modern history. And the human toll behind those numbers? It's heartbreaking. By 2018, 90% of Syria's 25 million residents were living below the poverty line. Right up until the regime's final collapse, an estimated 3.7 million people were struggling to survive on less than $3 a day. The entire economic foundation of the society was just completely shattered. A massive chunk of this economic nightmare comes down to the loss of the oil fields. Oil was Syria's main source of foreign currency, but as rival factions carved up different territories, Assad lost control of these critical resources. Think about this. In 2010, Syria was producing about 400,000 barrels a day. By 2023, that number plummeted to just 90,000. Then came the final nail in the economic coffin: international sanctions. Now, the U.S. had already considered Syria a state sponsor of terrorism since 1979, but in 2020, they rolled out the Caesar Act.
This legislation threw severe sanctions on anyone, anywhere in the entire world who dared to finance or do business with the Assad government. It completely froze foreign investment and essentially suffocated whatever little oxygen the Syrian economy had left. To give you a real sense of how dire it got, just look at the math at the very end. Assad's central bank held roughly $200 million in foreign cash reserves. Up against that, a national debt hovering between $20 and $23 billion. It's a sheer mathematical impossibility. The government was functionally bankrupt, totally unable to maintain even the most basic day-to-day operations of the state. So the economy is in ruins, and his regular army is depleted down to just 169,000 troops. Assad is facing some incredibly formidable opponents who had basically carved up his country. But none were more dangerous than HTS in the West. And here's why. While other groups relied entirely on foreign backing, HTS built this highly efficient, self-sustaining financial machine in the Idlib province. They took over the Bab al-Hawa border crossing, charging customs fees of $3 to $7 per ton on goods. They taxed local agriculture, specifically the olive trade. All of this generated around $15 million a month in revenue, making them a uniquely powerful and self-reliant threat that Assad simply could not root out. Now, for a whole decade, Assad managed to survive these threats for one reason: his 3 international lifelines. But in 2024, all 3 of those lifelines evaporated at the exact same time. First, Russia, completely bogged down in Ukraine, pulls out key troops and its S-300 anti-aircraft systems from Syria. Then, Hezbollah, severely decimated by their conflict with Israel and the loss of their leader, signs a ceasefire in November and retreats to rebuild. And finally, Iran, dealing with intense internal turmoil and direct conflict with Israel, just couldn't pour any more resources into a failing Syrian army.
So, without the money, without the military shield, and suddenly without his international allies, Assad's house of cards just instantly collapsed. That's what allowed HTS and their leader to sweep right into Damascus. When we step back and summarize Assad's legacy, the contrast is stark. The Syria he was handed in 2000 was fully unified under absolute Ba'athist control. The Syria he left behind in 2024 as he fled to Moscow, deeply fragmented, heavily traumatized, and economically ruined. He might try to blame his allies for abandoning him, but the policies that broke the country were absolutely his own.
And that leaves us here, at a truly profound turning point. As new leadership takes control of Damascus, we're looking at a massive power vacuum in one of the most volatile regions on the planet. This doesn't just redraw local borders, it impacts global markets, major refugee movements, and the entire international security architecture. So what does an HS-led future actually mean for the stability of the Middle East? It is the ultimate question right now, and the answer is going to rewrite global geopolitics for decades to come.